figure of the lawless law enforcer is an old trope. From Dirty Harry to Jack Bauer, we know that in popular culture, there are times when the law becomes an impediment to order and has to be suspended. Strangely enough, that time is all the time. There's almost never a period when there isn't at least one movie or program that is all about how the hard-bitten enforcers of justice have to occasionally throw the rulebook out the window and seriously brutalize some bad guys in order to save the day. In this segment, we'll review 3 television programs where the essential drama revolves around just this sociopathic ideal: 24, Zero Dark 30, and Homeland. What they all have in common is that they emerge from a cultural terrain formed by the War on Terror and its aftermath. They're all concerned in different ways with evil, evildoers, and the dilemmas that they pose for a supposedly virtuous democratic civilization. In 24, the fate of America and all of its citizens depends upon the heroic efforts of the Los Angeles-based counter-terrorism unit. Jack Bauer, played by Kiefer Sutherland, is one of their agents. The setting for 24 was not initially the War on Terror, and its novelty value didn't derive from any reflections on terrorism, so much as from its unusual use of so-called real time. It wasn't until the second season that it began to assimilate those themes: terrorists plotting bomb attacks, killing off leading politicians, using WMDs, and generally wreaking havoc in American cities in a way that no organization in real life has ever achieved. The important thing about this show as it develops is how it builds up the narrative pretext that can justify the use of torture and killings. Now, often this involves simple xenophobia or racism. Muslims have been particularly demonized, responsible for some of the most outlandish sequences of terrorism in the show. A fairly typical trope in this connection is the sneering, condescending bad guy who clearly has information, and they always do, and cannot be negotiated with. Everything is done to solicit the audience's rage. Take, for example, the scene in which Jack Bauer interrogates Nina Myers in Season 2. In the first season, Myers is second in command at the counter-terrorism unit. In this season, she is exposed as a traitor, someone who sold intelligence to terrorists so that they could strike the CTU building. It transpires that she knows the whereabouts of a nuclear bomb that has been planted in Los Angeles by an Islamic terrorist cell. So Jack Bauer has her in the interrogation room, handcuffed to a chair. And despite knowing Bauer's propensity for illegal and extreme violence at this point, she opts to taunt him and to suggest that he wouldn't torture her for fear of getting thrown off the case. Of course, being Jack Bauer, he charges her and begins to choke her almost to death. Or take the scene where he interrogates a paedophile named Marshall Gorin. Gorin is so smug, so clearly unrepentant, that it is almost a relief when Bauer shoots him in the chest without warning, then cuts off his head with a hacksaw.
I'm gonna need a hacksaw.
In other scenes, it is the urgency of the situation that licenses the extreme brutality, which includes, but is not limited to, Bauer torturing his own brother, Bauer hijacking a plane, Bauer cutting off another agent's hand, Bauer assassinating another agent, Bauer killing his own father. Kiefer Sutherland explained in an interview with Charlie Rose that the use of torture in the program is a dramatic device to show how desperate and urgent the situation is and to prove that the person they've interrogated is definitely the right person. He argues that the show is fantastical in the first place and that the use of such a device does not constitute approval of torture. This is all very well, but earlier this year, The Independent reported on what it called the 24 effect. A growing minority of the British public, some 36%, now believes that torture can be justified, and they attribute this to the effect of shows such as 24. Now, perhaps nothing in culture is ever this straightforward. The idea that television simply brainwashes people into believing that torture may be too simplistic. For example, in 2007, Brigadier General Patrick Finnegan visited the show's producers to beg them to cut the torture scenes. He said that this was damaging America's global reputation, but as importantly, he emphasized that exposure to the show had changed the behavior of rank-and-file troops, who now thought that torture was justified. Perhaps, General, they would be less susceptible to this idea if they were not engaged in a war of occupation against a people they'd been told were savages, in which torture methods were officially sanctioned and institutionalized. One of the most successful recent dramas was a movie by Catherine Bigelow about the hunt for Osama bin Laden named Zero Dark 30. Now, this is supposed to be a film about true events. The formulation used by the filmmakers is a bit more devious. They say the film is based on first-hand accounts of actual events. Now, this gives them a license to make stuff up. It is instructive, then, that one of the first things they made up was the existence of a prisoner who, through being waterboarded, gives up information that leads to the capture of Osama bin Laden. The resemblance between this character, Ammar, and a real-life person, Ammar al-Baluchi, is presumably not a coincidence. And therefore, the suggestion is that this real-life person gave up information under duress, leading to the capture of that other real-life person, Osama bin Laden. The problem is that it's a lie. Even by the CIA's own account, this guy never gave them any information. Moreover, it is linked to a bigger lie, which is that torture is a pretty good way to get accurate information out of people, as opposed to it being the case that a torture victim will say anything to end the horror. This is why actor and Academy member David Clennon denounced the movie for promoting the use of torture. Now, this is peculiar because, like so much cultural product these days, the movie was made hand in glove with the official government agencies, including the Pentagon and CIA, who knew the facts. But that itself points to another lie in Zero Dark 30, in that it was framed as a journalistic retelling of events. It was, of course, no such thing. It was based on the accounts given by government agencies and thus constitutes government propaganda. And unfortunately, that fact is missing in much of the controversy about Zero Dark 30. The hunt and extrajudicial killing of Osama bin Laden is, of course, the unmistakable good war to which the movie is committed. There can be no questioning the killing of someone so evil, surely. Who would be so nitpicky as to insist on due process in this case? And in this context, the movie is able to justify the repeated use of torture involving the full medieval repertoire of methods used by the CIA, from the strappado to drowning, the repeated gunning down of people with brown skin, and the continual racist denigration of Muslims and Pakistanis, whom the film refers to as Paks. Homeland has the same creators as 24 and is also owned by 21st Century Fox. Based on an Israeli show following the doings of soldiers in Lebanon and after their return home, Homeland focuses on CIA operatives who were deployed in Iraq and then returned to the US. The drama in the first series was based upon an extreme case of Stockholm Syndrome, in which a CIA operative named Nicholas Brody, captured by Al-Qaeda and severely tortured by them, had become one of their most effective operatives. And this was criticised by former hostage John McCarthy for being a ridiculous and unrealistic premise, but also for using scenes of torture and beating as titillation for bored audiences. But this was relatively light criticism. By the second season, it was charged that this show, like 24 and Zero Dark 30, was promoting anti-Muslim racism. This was because, as the CIA agents sought the terrorist Abu Nazir, it portrayed practically every Muslim and Arab as a potential terrorist plotter. Islam itself is seen as the enemy in this show. When Brody's wife in the first series finds out that he has converted to Islam, she picks up the Quran and shouts at him,
"These are the people who tortured you."
"These are the people who tortured you." Not Al-Qaeda, all Muslims were inculpated. By season 4, it was deemed by Laura Durkee in the Washington Post the most bigoted show on television. As Durkee writes, it is not just inaccurate about Islam or about Muslim countries. It works by mashing together every manifestation of political Islam, Arabs, Muslims, and the whole Middle East into a Frankenstein monster, global terrorist threat that simply doesn't exist. And that brings us to another aspect of the lawless law enforcer genre. However ingenious and complicated the plots, the world is never a morally complicated place. These shows are political thrillers, but the fundamental political questions are already settled by the big picture. A war to defend civilization against the barbarians. The enemy is always evil. There is never any choice but to torture or to kill. In this universe, the smart play is choose death. And while 24 was produced at the zenith of the War on Terror, a sort of Bush-era extravagance, Zero Dark 30 and Homeland are both Obama-era shows, produced by Hollywood liberals, and they reflect the tactics of that presidency. Extrajudicial killings, drone warfare, the secret use of torture, all the things that American liberals opposed when Bush did them, but which are now given a cultural seal of approval. They stand in the tradition of liberal nationalism exemplified by the war films of Steven Spielberg. Hollywood liberals have always sought the good war, the good fight, the good president to wage that fight. They used to look to World War II. Now, thanks to Obama, they can look to the present and America's global war on all fronts. They can finally stop worrying and love the bomb.